And then comes the haunting question, verse 40. When the Lord therefore of the vineyard cometh, what will he do unto those husbandmen? Christ's audience respond in verse 41, well, he'll destroy them, and he will lend out the vineyard to other people who will be typical, decent, working labourers, tenants, and give him that part of the vineyard, the produce which is his due. Whereupon Jesus, having caught them in their words, points to a prophecy in Psalm 118 verses 22 and 23 about a rejected stone becoming the cornerstone of the building, which stone then transmutes in the story and crushes his enemies. The Pharisees and chief priests twig. They perceive that he spake of them. And they think about killing him there and then, but too many people around, they think he's a prophet. We better wait. Now, following the remarks made earlier about this being a relatively simple parable, all agree on the identification of the various elements in the story. And by identification, we don't always mean equals, we mean sometimes more equivalent. The wicked tenants who do the stoning and killing and beating are the Jewish religious leaders. And this is what the leaders themselves confess, verse 45. They perceived that he spake of them. He's getting at us, they said. He's getting at us. That's what they said. And in this instance, they were right, actually. The vineyard is Israel. This is a familiar image. That's why in part we sang Psalm 80. Israel is the vineyard. Isaiah 5 speaks about that too. The song of my beloved about his vineyard. And of course Israel is the vineyard because the vineyard is that over which the wicked tenants, the religious leaders, rule and govern. The landowner who plants and owns the vineyard is God, because he's the one who owns Israel, his people. And in his providence, he appoints the men to care for his vineyard. The son in the parable is the Lord Christ himself. This is especially the case because he is the stone which the builders rejected, verse 42, and the stone which is rejected is the equivalent to the son who is killed in the parable. And of course he's the one who inherits God's true vineyard, perceived from the perspective of election, which is the chosen church. And then the servants, which are sent by the landowner to the vineyard to collect the dues with a D, not J, the dues are the prophets whom God sent to Israel, who were shamefully treated, especially by Israel's wicked leaders. So let's go through the parable. Look at the four things that God did for Israel, portrayed here as the householder preparing his vineyard. He planted it, and go the growths. Puts a hedge around it to keep out the wild animals, such as the boar that would come in and ravage it, of which we sang in Psalm 80. He dug a wine press, because later on you throw the grapes in there, and then you trample them out, and so sprinkle your garments with the blood of the grape, as it's called, and make your robes red. And he built a tower. Now here we could talk of all the good external gifts which God gave Israel in the Old Testament. His His revelation at Sinai through Moses, the redemption from Israel, the possession of a good land flowing with milk and honey, the declaration that out of their loins would come the Messiah, the seed of the woman who would crush Satan's head. We could then point out that Israel brought forth very little fruit, and we could denounce them with much fervour for their ingratitude and idolatry. This is the point of the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 5 verses 1 through 7, that God did so much for them, and when he looked for fruit they brought forth wild grapes, and he remonstrates with them, what more could I have done for my people? But this is not the point here in this parable. Well, after planting and preparing his vineyard, the landowner does two things. He leases it out to tenant farmers, and then he goes off to a far country. And the going off to a far country here does not refer to Christ's ascension to heaven, unlike our last parable. Because in the last parable, there's a return. The same one who goes away comes back to judge, which is Christ. But here it's not the Son who goes off to a far country, it's the Father who goes off to a far country. So that part of the parable is to be dropped. There is no application here as such. And the leasing of the vineyard to tenant farmers is equivalent to God's investing certain people as his office bearers in Old Testament Israel. This was not an act of grace. This was an act of providence. Providence with respect to the tenant farmers here, because they were wicked. There were some godly kings and elders and so on. That was also grace, not only providence, but here the husbandmen, the leaders in Old Testament Israel, are presented as wicked. So we come to the main point of this parable. The reason why it is so named, the parable of the wicked husbandman. Israel's religious leaders here shamefully treat God's Old Testament servants. The tenant farmers, the husbandmen, the Jewish leaders beat some of the prophets. They give them a hiding. They stone some. And they kill others. And if you cast your mind back to some of the martyrdoms and persecutions in the Old Testament by the very church itself, certain names will come to your mind. I hope one of them is Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the grandson of Jehoiada, whom we looked at recently in our series on Joash, the 7th king of Judah. He was stoned to death in the court of the temple because Joash had apostatized and hated the word of God. Jeremiah, under house arrest, imprisoned, thrown down a well. Micaiah, jailed for a long time. There were dozens and dozens murdered amongst the prophets by Jezebel and Ahab. Jeremiah 26 recounts the assassination of Urijah the prophet by wicked King Jehoiakim.